Kia ora. Kia ora, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I want to start with this quote that's relevant to this bill, and that quote is, "I've learned through my own experiences and the experiences of others around me that our young in particular can quickly begin to self-stigmatise when the media and society stigmatise them. When the media only portrays a picture of ghettoised, poverty-stricken group of troublemakers, then our youth can resign themselves to the fact that this is what they are," end quote. And Mr Speaker, in relation to this bill, I just want to say, isn't it so sad that it's not the media or external society that we're talking about here? We're talking about the government stigmatising our young people, Mr Speaker, and that is why we cannot support this bill. That quote was actually from my maiden speech, Mr Speaker, and young people, the education of them going into employment is something that's always been important to me and is also very important to the Labour Party. We heard the Minister talking about the social investment approach and how this particular initiative, this particular bill is in line with that social investment approach. Well, clearly, Mr Speaker, this is an indication of how flawed that social investment approach is. That social investment approach is short-sighted. It takes a deficit approach to our young people. It talks all about the negative measures in relation to a person. It depicts people as liabilities to this country, Mr Speaker, rather than focusing on the fact that people, particularly our young people, are the biggest resource and asset that this country has, Mr Speaker. So we will not be supporting this bill. The Minister talked about the fact that youth services to date have been successful. Well, actually, Mr Speaker, I know I'm on the Select Committee. We've asked for evidence of that, and there is no evidence to suggest that what we currently have in place is actually successful. And now we have the Minister putting more money into something where there's no evidence to support that it's been successful and looking to extend it, Mr Speaker. And to us, that makes very little sense. Mr Speaker, we put up 3 supplementary order papers that we thought were fair at the committee stages, and they were not supported by the national government. And I think really those supplementary order papers, when we look at them, would make sense to a lot of New Zealanders, hence why they were supported by a large number of the parties in the House, just maybe one short of actually being able to get them through. And the first of those supplementary order papers was in relation to education. Mr Speaker, one of the issues that we have with this bill is that it only encourages education up to NCEA level 2, and after NCEA level 2 is attained, then the focus goes primarily on employment. Now, we're not opposed to young people going into work, but first and foremost, we want to get behind young people to get the highest level of education that they can. Hence why we put up a supplementary order paper in committee stages to say, actually, it shouldn't just be NCEA level 2, it should be NCEA level 3 or higher. But instead, the government decided to vote that down, and what we have instead is a bill that does not support educational achievement any higher than NCEA level 2. The other supplementary order paper that we put up was a supplementary order paper that would have enabled young people who weren't identified through the government's predictive risk modelling to actually opt in to the youth services program if they thought it would be of benefit to them. And part of the reason that we put that particular order paper up was because of the fact that we want to take the stigma out of this program. So enabling young people who haven't been identified by the government's predictive risk modelling as being at risk to actually opt in would actually go some way to removing the stigma attached to this program. But again, the government voted against that supplementary order paper. And the third supplementary order paper we put up, Mr Speaker, was in relation to the expectations of young parents who participate in this program. And so the concern that we had about young parents was that the expectations on them to return to work or return to study were much greater than what they are for any other parent. And as was pointed out by the Human Rights Commission, it discriminates against young parents, Mr Speaker. So instead of having the 3 years to be able to stay home if you wish to care for your child, the expectation here was actually if there was a teen parent support unit within the vicinity of where that person lived, 6 months, and then they would have to go back, or if there wasn't a 10-parent support unit within their vicinity of where they lived, then the expectation was 1 year, Mr. Speaker. Now, of course, if a young person wants to return to work or study at an early stage, we would support that. In fact, we'd create that opportunity. But forcing them to do that when that expectation isn't put on older parents is unfair and, in fact, discriminates against them, Mr. Speaker. So we put that supplementary order paper up, but again, that was voted down, Mr. Speaker. There were other issues that we had in relation to this particular bill, and one of them was actually the fact that the government here is pushing for young people to go into work and study, which is not a bad thing necessarily. As I said before, we support that. We support young people being given the opportunities, but what they denied and what they failed to recognise was actually there are less opportunities for young people to be able to go into employment under that government. What they failed to acknowledge is that the number of young persons not in education, training or employment is currently at 87,200. This is over 26,500 more than when National took office in 2008. So the National government need to take responsibility for the fact that the unemployment rate for young people is actually in a worse state now than what it was when they took office in 2008. So when they turn around and say to us, actually we're going to extend this program because it's been successful, then of course we're going, well, hang on a second, how can it be successful when we have 26,500 more young people who are not in employment or education now than what we had when they took office in 2008. They are failing our young people, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the other issue that we have in relation to them and their youth services program and what's been suggested here in the bill are that there are rising concerns about the ability of the national government services to support youth into quality, stable employment. Given actually, Mr. Speaker, the failure of the government to facilitate benefit to work transitions for the main benefits. So not talking about just youth benefits here, we're talking about for the main benefits. So based on the March 2016 figures, with only 19,730 of the 49,907 benefit cancellations going into work, then of course we're concerned because only 7% of those total beneficiaries were actually going into employment, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, we've got concerns actually that their whole purpose is not necessarily to ensure that these young people go on to employment or go onto having better lives. But actually, Mr. Speaker, as what seems to be the case with the main benefits, their main purpose is just to get people off benefit with no actual concern for where they go on to or concern for whether or not their lives are actually better, Mr. Speaker. So we've got concerns that there's been very little tracking and monitoring with respect to whether or not young people or even older people who are on benefits, whether or not their lives have improved, whether or not there have been successful employment outcomes when they have left benefit. And we can see that in terms of the government's agenda when we just look at even their better public service target, which is to reduce welfare dependency, not to make people's lives better, but just to get people off benefit, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we won't be supporting this bill. Mr. Speaker, we did support it at first reading because we wanted to give it a chance, but we're disappointed that the government were not willing to work with the other parties to actually improve the content of this bill and to improve the services that are provided to our youth in this country, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker.
Alfred Naro.
I te manawa I te whakawā,